So I've passed through Silent Hill 2. Um, and I acquired the leave ending. This leave ending was triggered through a set of decisions or actions, which was both passive and active. I wasn't intending anything when it came to the endings, but I ended up acquiring the leave ending in which James forgives himself for what has happened, and accepts that his wife had died, accepts that he killed his wife, and accepts in some sense that he doesn't want to take responsibility, in the sense that he is a pure binary evil murderer who selfishly acted on his own intent to suffocate the life of another for pleasure. And he chose to forgive himself for what he had done. And I cried a lot in this game. And I also feel like crying right now in some sense. I've always been attached to Silent Hill. More so, I don't want to debase or disrespect the life of this experience, though I do not respect how financialization has corroded the metaphor of Silent Hill through a desire to take the idea and capitalize on its value in the social atmosphere. So I don't really play much Silent Hill outside of a few experiences or a few of these games. So when I was very young, I was about 12 years old, I was intrigued by the atmosphere. It was, I think, emotionally beyond my capacity to absorb. When I was maybe 12 years old, I ended up having to turn off the music because it was so horrific. I don't even know, it just emotionally sitting with me. There was a atmosphere of dread that went beyond my capacity to endure. Because I think metaphorically what Silent Hill was attempting through its canon or initial release was, in a sense, a representation of colonialism. This might not be felt as an intent, a direct intent. I don't think colonialism was an act, but I don't think necessarily colonialism. It's more about power and psychologically how the world acts on us. And so what we can see from this property, Silent Hill, is a Japanese developer that is working within a framework that is of the other, capital O, I suppose. If we consider how power has been operating within the past 50 years, the original game came out maybe in 1999. the world has been living through the influence of Western imperialism, and through a necessity to survive through that, we have the medium of video games as a means of creating ideas or representations of reality, and working through the dynamics of power in order to reach an audience, and an audience that needs to appease and sustain a company and a company that desires, in some sense, to make as much money as possible. That's the priority, just given how the logic of capital works, while also trickling down to helping, or not necessarily helping, but reaching as many people as possible through that calculation. And I would just say Silent Hill, it was a mirror to reality. We have Western world, a small Midwestern town in America, and Japanese developer. And I kept organizing parallels to this sort of dissonance of reality that Silent Hill represents. If you've played Silent Hill, you can see that it's like a small developing town culturally within the West. I remember living in Penticton, or even just living there prior, and it was the haunting similarities were disturbing me. You just have these, like Silent Hill, these diners and small establishments that were like shells of reality, like a smorgasbord Chinese restaurant, a sushi restaurant, a video game restaurant, a bookstore, of course a Starbucks, but they didn't have the accumulation of experience and focus, or whatever you might want to call this accumulation, in contrast to what you might see in a city or within, late capital globalism. It's a fascinating artifact of reality when you consider how these images of the other, how these Japan and the Japanese developers at Konami created a image of the West, but also a distortion. I think the distortion in itself is an interesting reflection of what living through an atmosphere of imposed otherness means to become a person psychologically. And this is the sense of the becoming, while also moving through your own socio-cultural dynamics of becoming that, of course, are imposed upon us. We get interesting aspects of character development through Harry, and in that case it was Harry, and uncovering or understanding what his connection to Silent Hill was, which was his daughter, who was the adopted or child that he had acquired from Silent Hill. Cheryl was, I believe, the daughter of, or the clone in some sense of, I believe her name was Ashley, of who was the daughter of Dahlia. Anyways, it's a long, complicated story. In Silent Hill 2, we have James, who's unwilling to accept the truth that he killed his wife. And there was a lot of unprocessed grief in that delusion. He took the pure event of murder and contorted the psychological motivations into a delusion. He couldn't understand, I suppose, why he killed his wife, and the movement towards delusion disregarded the capacity for him to process further of what had actually happened. And so he goes to Silent Hill. And Silent Hill is a metaphor of psychological processing through the death drive, or Freudian Thanatos, of which I haven't read, I don't really know too much about, but the death drive can be, I think, basically understood as a process of repetition. So if we think about our biological drives, we have certain repetitions that we pass through in order to reproduce ourselves, right? We eat, we sleep, we reproduce, and we survive. And these are repetitions. So once we disassociate the practical function of a human act from its reproductive cycle, and we do it, the act for it, the act itself. Say we eat for pleasure, or we have sex for pleasure, or we work for profit. Once we disassociate the habitual act towards a psychological goal, then we produce the death drive. And if we go back to James, if we go back to trauma, the death drive ends up turning into something like a metaphor, almost like an escape. When the death drive becomes self-destructive, then we end up in addiction. There's something underneath the habitual acting through of a reproductive or social need, in order to mask something that has disrupted our sense of continuity with ourselves and the world. And in the case of James, it was killing his wife. If we can organize a very generalized sense of why James would kill his wife through a psychological processing space, then we can dissolve the responsibility unilaterally of James's guilt and shame that turned his act into a binding, torturous loop that ended up with his traversal through Silent Hill. And Silent Hill is the representation of his acting through of delusion ending up in self-harm. So we can almost look at Silent Hill as addiction. He must survive through trials of representation. In the sense, there would be enemies that represented his sexual, his emotional, different aspects of his psyche in which he would have to confront. And those in the sense of the addict, those aspects would haunt him. So often how addiction works is, once we've become lost in a confusion of our attachment to the world, or our connection to the world towards the attachment, and the attachment can be understood as when we can't let go. We can't let go of something. And through that not letting go, we become stuck to a thing. Say in the sense of drugs. Once we cannot resolve something psychologically that we're passing through. And it's not weakness. And I think this is why I often am so angry about a lot of, I think, growth psychology, is that it often creates binaries of strength and weakness, whereby individuals are graded and judged that if they're not able to traverse through their suffering or immaturity, then they have a weak, or they are weak. And once they've mustered enough strength through enduring suffering or pain, often categorized as grit, then they'll be able to transfer through and release their weakness and become strong. I don't really know if I agree with this so much. I think it's a very diluted sense of growth, because like James, growth requires uncovering and unwinding a psychological knot, or knots in the plural sense of there is no there's no linear pathway through life, where life is going to, as a creature in Silent Hill, present itself outside of context. It's not as if we are, I think, actors in a world of continuity in which we are supposed to understand what is actually happening. I think life is metaphor in that it's presenting trials and mirroring a psychological movement towards something elusive and liminal that goes beyond a capacity for humans to comprehend. And so as James would move through something like a prison, I would then, or anybody would then, be moving through their own psychological metaphor of prison, because prison is the representation of judgment for the act. And prison is a institution of which is produced in order to regulate the social body, regardless if the social body is an ethical structure or not. It's whereby the rule set of which allows the social body to move a prison or a judge or judicial system is employed in order to regulate and lubricate that system. And so moving through that, then I would be working through my own guilt and shame for my own actions. It was probably like 2 hours of traversal in the game, but psychologically it was very demanding to move through such an experience. Outside of that, James was also moving through other aspects of his own psychology. He would move through a hotel, which would represent like a vacation. Something of an absence of growth or pain or suffering that we have to live through ordinarily as an expectation or a need in order to survive. There was a sense of ease in Silent Hill, in this hotel, because there was only the fog. And I think the fog is a representation of the truth of what living through reality is. There might be light there, but once we go into the facts of what reality is, we can come to understand that there's a whole matrix of interconnected coincidence and accident that produces reality and produces beauty, and fog in that masks or reveals inversely the unseen to what is seen through that process. Because if we were to, ongoingly calculate or perceive reality through its complexity, we would be psychologically overwhelmed continuously and exhausted if our brains weren't able to focus on its process of continuity and reality absent that aspect. And so I don't know what I'm trying to say about this, but when James recognizes that he killed his wife, it gave him an opportunity to unravel the question, why? And once he was able to, I think, and this is going with myself, talk about to honor his event. And this is something too about the social. It's like there is the psychological interiority of the individual, and there is something like a necessity to communicate the interiority into the exteriority of and with the other that allows an opportunity for the event to unravel itself. Else we end up in suicide. We end up in psychosis. We end up in many different states of psychological distortion that impede our capacity to continue in the world. And it gave him the opportunity to recognize that he felt guilty and he felt angry. He felt angry that the world was unfair, that his story, the heteronormative becoming that is socially acceptable and honored, was disavowed. It was betrayed by the world, and the world in the sense of the biological. His wife got sick, and the sickness was terminal. The sickness distorted Mary. She lost her appearance. She lost her strength. She lost her mobility. She lost her psychic capacity to function, and she turned from a story to Mary, a person. And that was probably also a part of James's anger, was that the fluidity of the heteronormative structure was dissolved, and he was forced to confront the real or truth that nothing is as we desire it to be. We are not the controllers of experience. We are something like actors, and we do have a capacity to choose, but it's like moving through a set of, I suppose, choices, right? And in this sense, James killed her because Mary's sickness and her state of being was too much for him. He wanted his life back. He wanted this fantasy, in some sense, of continuity and connection and predictability to continue in a way that illness wasn't allowing anymore. As illness changed Mary, she was both not available to him anymore. She was resentful. She focused on the negative. She became self-consumed by this illness, which led to her resentment of the world. She became, and this was interesting, that she was resentful of the hospital and its profit model. She became resentful of her own image, desiring the idea of beauty that held her to the world, and her own continuity in it, and her relationship with her husband. And she pushed back against it in a way that angered James, to the point where, in order to end his suffering and her suffering, even if she was going to die anyway, he killed her, suffocated her. And in the ending that I acquired, he accepted it that partially this wasn't his responsibility. There was something in a way that psychologically wasn't allowing him to survive, and I think there was something instinctual about the act that forced James to move through the death of another in order to preserve his survival. And yeah, it's so heavy emotionally to move through such an experience, because you're both a passive actor in these and I think that's also why people, and even me psychologically, I disrespect games. Is like there's this aspect of entertainment, like I don't even know what entertainment means, and that's why I don't even like entertainment. It's often maybe like a screen to reality, but yeah, I feel really attached to James in the sense that I've moved through stuff that has been very similar. I think we all have. We lived through Delusion. We lived through so many cushions psychologically in order to dissolve a social atmosphere of storytelling that has a capacity to crush us if we don't move past the complexity of ordinary life. And just as James killed his wife, it was a response or a reaction, I suppose, to living through ordinary life and having to survive through the unpredictability of events that end up testing our capacity for continuity in a world that wasn't of our choosing. Yeah, so that's